Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Till now, we have talked about a variety of context of culturally responsive built environments, starting from the scale of a small dwelling to the scale of a house settlement, and even much bigger, the landscape of imaginative landscapes. So today, we are going to cover about in the education, especially in the built environment education, what are the issues we do have in understanding the culturally responsive built environments, and also how we can make, as a teachers, how we can make the students to understand better the culturally responsiveness in the built environments. So I've titled this lecture as Pluralism in Built Environment Education. In fact, one of the important contribution on this aspect is actually comes from School of Planning and Architecture Bhopal's journal, the Spandrel, the very first issue, which was issued in 2010, and that was focused absolutely on pluralism in built environment education. So it covers a very wide range of holistic and philosophical aspects of the architectural education and also the practical issues within it. So I'll be covering a few of it. At the same time, I'm also going to cover about one of my PhD scholars' ongoing work. I'll be showing some of his literature work, what he was working on, and then my own experiences I club into how I have started working onto it through these learnings. So this is how I'm going to frame this lecture. So if you look at the dictionary meaning, the pluralism means holding more than one office, especially and ecclesiastically office or benefice at a time. The second meaning talks about a form of a society in which members of minority groups maintain their independent cultural traditions. So why I brought the second meaning is that is where it talks about how these smaller groups also maintain their independent cultural traditions, at the same time how they are also having a kind of network and the connectivity and how they work together. So that is how we try to relate in the architectural education. In the architectural education, if you look back from the Roman times, the master builders, they are the master builders. There's no technical qualification of architecture or engineering, they're all the master builders, artists. And if you look at Duomo and even the Vatican City, huge plazas, and the Michelangelo's work, you look at the Brunelleschi's work. When I was visiting in Duomo, I come across this small drawing of Brunelleschi's drawing of the Duomo. And I was very much impressed, the kind of proportions, the kind of understanding of that scale and the proportion, the way the people have imagined of that time with that kind of scale and proportion and the human scale into it. And it was really superb in it, without any computer simulations and without any architectural any other tools. So it is just the human mind, the intellect, which has imagined all such global spaces. If you move on to the modern trends of architecture, that is where we talk about Frank Lloyd Wright's, Louis Kahn, furthermore Chandigarh, Le Corbusier's work. So in fact, there are some few photographs where I could get from the internet of Frank Lloyd Wright with his students. So there's a master and how he interacts with his students and how they learn from him, and he becomes a kind of a role model of how to work on and how to learn. So that was a system of education. In fact, H.D. Chaya, in his article in Spandrel, he brings the Louis Kahn's quotations of, schools began with a tree, with a man under a tree who did not know he was a teacher, discussing his realizations with a few who did not know they were students. So it is basically the mutual interaction between a teacher and student, and neither the teacher is not aware of that he is a teacher, and the student is also not knowing that he is a student. So that the realizations have shaped beautiful experiences and learnings. And in today's world, if you look at it, in that time the students used to look upon him, and They used to see, even their children need to follow upon their masters, that kind of respect and ideologies do take care. But now in today's generation, that whole classroom environment is now standardized, and that whole intimacy has gone, is mostly forgotten. So Louis Kahn, he talks about an idea of how an individual communicating to several individuals, because it talks about the capacity of how one communicates his ideas, and after due deliberations accept the ideas. So obviously you communicate your ideas and you might have to deliberate upon the ideas, and only these are found acceptable. Sometimes it may not. Through the process of checks and counter checks over a period of time, intelligently, sensually, and the level of performance they generate in patterns of life and living. So what he talks about is the kind of communication, how you interact, how an I becomes we, so, and how one individual start interacting with his society, learn their needs, and how they deliberate upon it, how we convince it, and how it is acceptable, and through a trial and error process, how it is realized further. So from that, if we move on to much more further of bringing into the cultural context and the environmental context, if you look at the Renzo Piano's work, the Jean Marie Chibaju Cultural Center, which was was built on the kind of for Kanak tribes, and what it is representing is, though the architect might have been skilled in a different continent and a different context, but then how he is representing the local context of it, the cultural context and the environmental context, and blending with nature. And that is where the vernacular process, how he understood that and how he blended with the kind of modernized understanding. So I think in our previous lectures we did also talked about how our traditional principles of town planning, which have talked about the generic layouts of the bazaars and the towns, and especially with the Bonnie McDougall's work in Text into Form, where he talked about the Sinhalese traditions and the Tamil traditions and the Manasara, what they have talked about. So how these hierarchical orders, how the society has been represented in the spatial orders. So now coming to the post-independent era of Indian planning and architecture. So if you look at the Chandigarh, that is where the democratic thoughts and how different philosophies, when we talk about architect, it is not just an artist who can become an architect, and it is not just, there is an engineering component in it, there is a sociology component in it, there is a geology component in it, there is economics component in it. So this all together, that is how it contributes. That is where the pluralism, they are not individual on their own, but they contribute to the whole set of a building as a product, as an outcome, so that is where how different professions has to correlate with it. So but in the present context, if you look at it, when we are planning for any kind of settlements or any habitat level works, and much of the work has been mostly talks about the engineering or the service orientation or the architectural aspect, and maybe it might marginalize to economic aspect of it, but there are a lot of things which we can learn from the geography, sociology, and because that is where we study about people, how people, what kind of things people need and aspire, and how they relate, and how change is addressed. So this is where we talk about Chandigarh, how the sectoral planning approach has been developed, and more of the standardized models and application of the new technology of the prefab and concrete technology. So if you look at the way the architects work, it is a drawing board and there's live models, the physical models which they used to visualize. So just come from Brunelleschi's sketch, and today what we are working in the Chandigarh is about, so basically the whole stretch we are talking about the physical manifestation, so people are drawing, drafting things, people are detailing it out, but that is where when today we are talking about urban design, and many new courses are coming into the picture, and sometimes the many of the courses They do exist for a short time and they mold it into a different way, and depends on the demand and need of the society. But I want to bring to your account, when we talk about urban design or anything today, when we are talking about this, but I would like to see that it is one of the first course which was started in University of Liverpool, which was established. So first planning school was established in 1909. That is where they call it a civic design. So how we engage the people in it, how putting the people in the center. So in fact, even today, this is a course which you see from the Department of Geography and Planning. And so putting people in center is one of the criteria which was there in the early 19th century itself. And that is where they talked upon the analysis, the design, and the policy formulation, because which is the decision making, and the conducting part of it, the management and the governance aspect of it. So that is where you need to involve various stakeholders into it. So now with the kind of architecture which we are handling is of two extreme scales. One, if you look at the top, you see Doha, and which was a fisherman settlement, and how this whole thing have changed in 50 years of time with the oil boom and the market. So the challenges, and even these urban structures, they do have different challenges, especially with the density. When it goes for the density, there are traffic issues, there's water issues, there are employment opportunities, there are economic regeneration aspects of it. At the same time, we are ignoring, especially in Indian context, not much of the focus is going on the EWS, the economically weaker sections, and the poor. And so there's a huge gap between the way you are thinking of, because the market is coming, the architects today, because the clientele is more onto a business side of it. But if you look at the need of it, that is where we need for rural housing, for the economically weaker sections. So where they may not afford an architect, or where they themselves start building upon it. So that is where a big gap is coming. So this is very important in this phase, that we need to develop a culture that these are also an architectural issues, and these are also something we should handle, and we should train our students to the ways to handle into it, and again different ways of entrepreneurs into it. So today's our cities, if you talk about context, one we are talking about the rich and poor, and one we are talking about the conflicts, like the Nicosia example which I told about, the conflicted situations. There is the social issues, there's the political issues within it, and how the city has been divided into it. And even in public space, I think in our previous lectures we did discuss of the Taksim Square issue of how the Geji Park. So how bringing back this military barracks which was demolished, and then again when it's proposed, and how a huge protest sprung up. So obviously this is whole process to do with the communication, and because how a master plan have determined to a park, and again bringing back into it, and how the people have responded to it. So there's because that is where, if you don't participate those people in the process, so there might be very adverse effects. And coming to a little the labor level and the micro level and the material level, if you look at the master Laurie Baker's work of, so that is where he talks about he's referred as a guru of low cost housing, and that is where he focused on the materials, the training the masons, and developing alternative technologies into it. So there are a lot of manuals which were published from Costford, and which could be easily understandable by a common man, and where he can implement it and develop it. So this is where one has to reach to the level of the locals and started learning from there and developing it from there. Like the same Costford, when I took my students to Jangal Chula in a kind of slum where Laurie Baker's work himself have done some buildings there. But today one has to look at it like this, after many years, how the same place have responded for it in a different way, because the needs are changing, people are changing, generation is changing. So obviously, like this house on the right hand side, and you see the left hand side, how they have been in contrast, and how they are used in a different way, especially with the light and ventilation aspect of it. Though it is efficient by inside it is very cool, and by technology it is fine, but then see how people have adapted to it. That is one important learning one you have to look at it. So in the recent times we are looking at more, we are moving towards more of the participatory approaches. That is where we are learning with communities of Kutch. That is where the Hunashala work talks about how they engage from start to end process of the whole building process, and in the decision making process how they can enhance and how they can empower the communities. So this is how a lot of works has been moving on. So what we have discussed now is it's like we are moving from a singular vision to a shared vision. So we are in the architecture is now taking us, it is not just one man's dream about it, but it is about a shared collective responsibility, how we communicate what we want and what we need, and how an architect take that and how he can address that in a collaborative way. That is the most important challenge. So even in our education, engaging our students in with the people, understanding their local issues, their domestical issues, and for instance, you can see some of the workshops which were conducted. We designed for blind people and we designed for differently able people, but have we ever experienced that, how they feel about it? So this is one of the trainings which we were giving in the workshops of United Differences and Design for All workshops, and then where students were tied and they asked to roam around to experience how a blind person could experience a place. And that is how, an architect, as an architect, you really understand what really they need, right? And similarly, I myself was being part of intensive community participation techniques, and I used to live like a fisherman for some time, because when the moment I started living with them, every day by day, every day is a learning process. Every day it is molding me, and I am learning in details, and even how my learnings, what I learned during my masters and PhDs, and how I have transferred into my education system. If you look at my student Piyush Sharma, who was just a bachelor student, but then he was designing a hamlet in the disaster affected areas of Uttarkashi. So what I did was I asked him to, why don't you go and live with the community and learn with them what were the problems they did, and then how you can work. So this is one of the community participation exercises we did in the village. So he'd made a small module designs, and then he explained to them, and they tried to negotiate, and they tried to suggest some few alternatives and some modifications, and that is how a model has been adjusted. So maybe when it is built real in a real sense, maybe it further get adjusted, but at least in that process he understood what are the existing vulnerable conditions. And in my own study, what you see is when the architect doesn't address the local traditions. So you can see a puja room, a worship area, is now converted into worship area, but actually it was a toilet given by the built environment professions that this is a toilet, but they denied it in that particular location because of vastu purposes, and they converted it as a worship area. And see how the transformation took place in Tamil Nadu. So that is where the culture plays an importance. So we need to make our students to understand how this adaptation process, that is where we talk about adaptation, because we only talk about giving a solution, okay, but with that solution how people tend to adapt. So that needs a longer time observation. So we need to make our students to engage with that process, and they need to understand that adaptation process, because so that they don't commit the same mistakes what their elders have done. So Amos Rappaport again he talks about environments are thought before they are built and design trials, however imperfectly, to reach some ideal embodied in an image or schemata or a model. So one need to understand the culturally responsive built in, how you need to understand the culture of the people and the society, then only it will be easy for you to understand their built environments. So now look at the stage where we are moving with the advance of technology, CAD tools, the virtual reality, many other techniques which are coming. So this is one Kiruna example which I already explained in your previous lectures. So in fact, if you look at it with the virtual reality, without any of So what you have just seen is a kind of visualization of the Kiruna highway which they are proposing, and you see what the researchers are thinking with the kind of tools which we have. Anyone can become urban planners. So now the whole urban planning situation has come to your desktop, almost your laptop, right? So from understanding a site at a bigger level and working with various people and various agencies and various stakeholders, but now it has hardly narrowed down to a desktop. That is the irony. So if anyone can become urban planner because it's only a tool, but in reality how it works, how it is managed, so how we negotiate, how we deliberate upon it, so that itself is a process where a student learns into it. And this one is from the Leo University of Technology, where I have previously worked. So similarly, again, this is also from the same university. We have now the digital architecture, which is now very popular in many of the countries and many of the schools which are focusing much on the digital architecture requirement. So now it's actually, if you look at it from the hand tool technology, how we moved on to the machine tool technology, and now we are moving to the information tool technology. So this whole process, earlier a carpenter used to work and cut down and make all these dwellings, but now the mechanized process of it has been have industrialized the whole production process. But now it is just sitting in a computer, you can how you can format certain forms, and how you can actually produce various artistic forms, at the same time all the details of it, the connections with more precision. So what you see on the left and right hand side are some of the students' work from LTU Sweden, and this is actually a live model which was Mania Gambodi was one of my colleague who used to work on, especially on the material aspects of it and how we can work on different shapes. And this was a master's project, especially on the Tree Hotel project, where he developed various frames, how they can made as a accommodative space. So these are some of the advancements which are going on. But now with the kind of tools, like at least when I started my architecture, there was AutoCAD was in the very beginning stages. But now today many softwares flowing every day. A software is coming up, and you can see the SketchUp, the renders. They look like a very real renders, but they're actually done in a software, right? So whether it is in America or whether it is in UK or whether it's India, so the software is more of a kind of, it standardizes the whole of its textures and its outcome. So this is in Sweden, and where some of my students work. So one of the important person when we talk about pedagogy is especially we have to talk about Ashraf Salama, where he extensively worked on the trends in the architectural education, especially the pedagogic aspects of it. And I try to simplify in, so basically how the shift from mechanist pedagogy to systematic pedagogy. So when we talk about our architectural education, which is very unique from the engineering education, we have the schools, different schools have different thoughts processes, and different schools have different admission procedures, how they are recruited and how the students are recruited, what are the eligible skills they need as a basic requirement of architectural education. And the way the grades are tallied, they also make a big difference. And the way the subjects are organized, the way the courses have run, the way the lessons are formulated. So all these actually formulate Even here in systematic pedagogy also, yes, they are the same thing, but what is the most important thing is how are they relevant to the society, because whatever we are learning in the studios, how we are relating it to the society, so how it could be applicable. So that is where we can get a real time learning. So here we need to differentiate about, especially when we talked about grading and things like that, the purpose of assessment and evaluation, they both sound similar, but they have a very fundamental difference. In evaluation, what we do is we judge the quality by looking at the plant. I don't know who made this cartoon, but I got it from S.P.A. Bhopal, and it says the too short and not enough and gives a C grade or C minus. But now the other side of it, the assessment, they say you put water or you put some kind of manure in it, and then so that it can be increased, the quality could be enhanced. So that is where assessment talks about the continuous assessment, which talks about the increase in quality, whereas the evaluation, it cuts off there. You are this, you are this, you are this. That's the thing. That's a fundamental difference one has to understand. So I think as a teachers, we need to look on the left hand side of it, the assessment, how we can increase the quality of it. Yeah, this is one of my favorite slide. Is it true just because most penguins believe it? So in our education system, of course, starting from a master's, we never questioned our masters or anything like that. But in the present context, if you see, if someone says something and if you just follow it, right, without having a understanding whether it is true or not, whether it has any other impacts or any other alternatives to it. So that is where a student thinking has to start. That is where the research capacities will build upon it. So you have to judge if someone, even if your senior or a boss or your professor talks about it, you need to really understand and think about it, whether it is workable in this context or not. And then you need to pose the questions. That is where the the realization aspect comes. That is where the communication opens between the teacher and the student. But if you just bluntly believe, oh, he said, and then I just follow, it is correct, it might be correct. Oh, so it may be wrong in some aspects. So that is where your intellectual will come out of it. So what we are looking is now, as we said about the pluralism, there are many components within the built environment educations. One is HVAC, one is the society aspects, one is the technical aspects of it, one is the drafting, one is the artistic aspect. But what we are doing is we are learning each segment by segment. If you look at the human anatomy, how intestine works, how a stomach works, how kidneys work, and how lungs work, we are learning individually. But what we need to learn is, we need to learn as a system how it is structured and how it works. So that is where we have to see how we need to bring the cooperation of different systems together and make it work to make a better product and better manageable product. So, and as Einstein's quote says, information is not just a knowledge, but the only source of knowledge is experience. So one has to experience it. So that is where he talks about learning itself is an experience, and one can learn by experience, exploring, and executing. E. So the important questions which I'm bringing into your front is, does the current system of architectural education introduce and integrate different types of knowledge needed for the successful creation of built environment? Like, as I bring again my space-time framework here, as I discussed you just now, the human anatomy. What happens when if an ecologist talks about some data, whether have you integrated in the planning of your settlement or in your procurement of materials, So which means a knowledge of this level, whether it is integrated at this level or not, the relevant one. Does the current system of architecture place high value on research and knowledge acquisition? This is one of the fundamental questions. Has it reacted effectively to the needs and demands placed in the profession by society? So what are the current needs that that we are having right now, and how we are addressing the societal needs. So till now we talked about basic fundamentals of how we are moving on from an artistic aspect, and how we are moving from a singular aspect to the shared aspect of it. But then I would like to bring some more philosophical aspects, and why I am bringing today now at Martin Heidegger's work. That is where he talked about the being and time, and where he talks about the body and mind. So the body goes on to the places, and then the mind interacts on how you experience it. Because the moment I was talking about experiencing the places and executing it, obviously it is talking about how your mind is interacting. And in the same note, how in a holistically, how H.D. Chaya, Professor H.D. Chaya, how he puts up is, one is he talks about one is from the part to the whole relationship, because that is where, when we talk about body and mind, so it starts from who am I. So if you look at it, I and how I becomes we, you, family, school, neighbors, from so how you are related to your family, your neighbors, your society, your village, your town. I think I did explain this in our early lectures of understanding identity, place and identity, how our I grows upon it. So if you look at, the I is emerging into higher scale to become the consistent axis of self. So this is our self, that is gradually interacting with the society. So that is where the culture talks about how I becomes an individual becomes a social individual. And so whereas how it performs is that it works in space and time. So here, if you look at, it's a very important aspect. This I, the notion of I, is changing in time and space. The moment he goes to school, he is relating with his school network. But here, what you have to understand is, in that changing I aspect, you have to see the time and space are constantly changing. From school, he goes to a nearby job, then his circle differs, but what is very clearly points out, the time and space are constantly changing, but I and change are the two constants. I am here and the change is there. So the change, which is a dynamic thing, which is still considered as a constant, and this change becomes the meaning of life. From your family, from your individual, how you grow to the society, and that is how the meaning of life is produced. When I expands into larger scales and unifies with others, one starts feeling others' pains and pleasures as mine. So that is where you take the responsibility, how you share the responsibility and pain and the pleasures of others. That is where you start learning from each other. We make a group of understanding individuals. So then that is how a group. Thus, a larger unified force of a couple, family, a nation, an Indian. As I talked to you about how we become from a local to the global representation, how I am from Nellore, I am an Andhraite, and I am from India, I am from Asia, like that, how a larger representation keeps growing. And here, if you look at with your experiences, how your personal experience and how it can actually be experienced through the conscious and mind intellect instrument. And here you can see I am aware, I am confident, I am fearless, I am efficient. So which actually talks about your capacity. And this comes only through kind of experience and interaction. Right? That is where the meaning of your life is produced. So this is from part to whole. And in the architectural processes of the world, the process of ordering time, space and forms, the process is called Panchikaran. Panch is 5. The becoming of worlds where the man is the microlithrics of the universal totality at all, the existence level of idea, processes and medium of the macro level. As I said, this is the man and how he interacts with his family, with his neighborhood, with his nation, with his continent. So that talks about the universal totality, how he interacts with the all scales of it. And the second aspect which Professor H.D. Chaya talks about is the whole to part relationship. So as he talks about the I, myself and me, and basically the whole the body and mind processes and the relationships which you have with your family, with your neighbors, with how your attributes and your qualities, and what is your role, so all these things which actually generates the will and energy. That is where I talked about in the previous slide. It talks about the capacity to attain your will and energy to do something. And this is where you have to understand. And man expands himself, he expands ideas, he expands energies and builds tools, systems and vehicles. In architecture, the shelter and the habitat and the expansions of total man, both between the individual and universal scales of self. So that is what I explained to you in a previous slide. So architecture is the extended process of the evolution of place, time and people. So that is the productive nature of it. And this whole process, why we are talking is God's universe is complete only with man, and without him it is incomplete. So just imagine if man doesn't exist on this earth, what happens to the earth? So man is complete only with his expanding tools. Without them he is incomplete. So how he expands his energy, how he expands his surviving tools, how he interacts with the nature, how he makes his identity process, that is where he develops his tools and services. So without that he is incomplete. So then he develops a kind of preliminary model. It's not to be read as it is, but it's very in a rudimentary stage, where he talks about how the 5 elements, the space, air, light, water, earth, and how the human senses, the sound, touch, smell, and then how each of these are represented with the kind of architectural sensitivities, acoustical aspect of it, ventilation aspect of it, the visual aspect of it, the aesthetic aspect of it. And again, the 5 processes, how we communicate, how we physically move, how we work, how we discard, how we create. And then the architectural transform, how it transforms into a design language, and the circulation dynamics and spatial experiences, activity spacious efficiencies, data collection and choice, emergency forms. Similarly, the mental state sheets, the material, how the material will give certain environment, soothing environments, how it can impulse certain emotional aspects of it, and intelligent and judgment. So like that, it talks about how this whole process into a man interacts with it, and how the space and time provides different experiences within it. And then he makes a from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. This is a kind of comprehensive conceptual model, of the total education system. You have the young mind who wants to learn the making of built environment, and then you have the faculty and the education, which are the sources, and you have the needs and expectations of the society from profession in time. So that is where you have the evaluation of curriculum content. And then you have got the how we program it, talking about the techniques and tools of teaching, evaluation methods, the curriculum structures, and then that is where how we impart the value education and what kind of necessary training. And if you look at it in a design, this is the design core, and then how the parallel things add on to it and supplement, and that is how the whole education, the curriculum is being managed. And this is a simple model just to understand the structure. And I want to bring you to the most important aspect now, is especially the CAP, which is the cognitive and affective and psychomotor skills. Because in cognitive, what it is like, basically how the mental skills, the knowledge, and whereas how we actually memorize from the brain, what we understand. Whereas in the psychomotor, how we have to get the ability to do. And whereas in affective, it talks about the heart, brain, hand, and the heart. So the attitude and the values to it. So there are various taxonomies, especially how we can, especially in the education psychology, and one of the aspects which talks about is cognitive, affective and psychomotor. We have so many techniques, but I am just pointing out the Bloom's taxonomy, which was actually made a kind of pyramid of which talks about the evaluation which was on the top and the synthesis here. But then in the later 2002, this Bloom's taxonomy got revised, and that is where the synthesis became the creation becomes into the higher order and the evaluation comes into the later order. So the remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, create. Whereas the earlier one was in knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis. So that creation was in the top of the pinnacle. So now in the paradigm shift in the digital age, if you look at this one, now earlier we were thinking about the form, but we are more focusing on the form generation, how we are able to generate, and that is where we are using the CAD tools, and especially with the animation and the parametric designs. And if you look at the Franco Gehry's work of, one is the digital form, but now that is where we are talking about digital architectural design. That is where we are talking about the digital process, how the process will generate the digital form of it. So that is more important. This whole process is coming from the mechanical engineering point of it, the material aspect of it, and as well as the architectural aspect of it. And again, there is two sets. When we are talking about the generative models, which is through shapes and grammars, how we achieve certain shapes. But the other thing is performance models, because especially nowadays in the last decade, the energy focus has been very much emphasized, and that is where how the performance models have increased. So in the CAD simulation model, we have the generation, performance, and evaluation. Whereas in performance, we have performance simulation, and then generation, and then evaluation. So the two orders are slightly vary. And this is how you see in any architectural course, we have the fundamental foundation first year, and the second year is on elaboration, we slightly increase on the scale of it. And the third year, which is on the integration, we integrate the services, we integrate the materials, we integrate the working drawings. And then the fourth year, we talk about the advanced specialization, whether you want to go to urban design or interior design. And in the fifth year, we talk about the exploration, evaluation, and experience. So that is where you work under an architect, you experience, you develop your thesis, you explore something, you evaluate something. So this is how the skeleton of it goes on. And in this culturally responsive built environment course, why we are addressing the education is because in today's tools and the way the education is going on, the contextual sensitivity, how it is addressed in the current pedagogy system, and what are the various skills and how the knowledge and values, how they are imparted and how they are assessed. That is, we have to and how we can rethink, especially in this digital age. So it's a very nice cartoon of I have taught Snoopy to whistle and I can't hear him whistle. And I said I had taught him, but not he had learned it. That is where the importance of outcome-based education. So whether he has learned it or how we can ensure that he has learned it or not. I think in my experience as a teacher, at least in Indian context, in a decade time, I'm fortunate to see handmade drawing from only 3 students from final years in all working of me. Because after the CAD and Photoshops and everything come, people hardly prefer to do their thesis in the hand. Very few students who worked with the hand. I'm fortunate to get that. So because that gives a very different intellect altogether. And similar, what I am observing and what the international scholars also, the Malgrave also talks about, you collect a variety of architectural products, portfolios, when you get for admission reports, you get from Asia. Different from China, Beijing, Thailand, India, Sri Lanka, they keep sending the portfolios. But what they figure out, they all look like same, because almost sketches and study models or finished models are almost becoming extinct, and they are printed on standardized width and quality because of the nature of the equipments we have, and the same graphical techniques, the same presentational techniques. So irrespective of whether the context is in desert or in an architect circle or in a temperate grassland, irrespective of that landscape and geography, they are all look same. Mostly they have the same texture, same trees, same buildings, same waterfronts. So that is where we see the computer aided design, how it is improving, how it is conditioning the thinking, the design thinking. This is from actually one of my students, Sangeet Pillai. He is working on his work on how this computer aided design, drafting techniques, how they are conditioning the design thinking process. So it's not still completed, but I'm just showing you the literature work. And how this nature of development of students' creative design process and design skills. This computer is enabling and as well as disabling the thinking process. And what he did was he mapped all the existing softwares and where these actually softwares are used actually from the conceptual level to the construction and the erection side of it. So what are the various softwares we actually use and where are these useful? So to get a holistic mapping of it. And one is we look at with these tools what we are going ahead with the modernization aspect of it. That is with the Neelkanth Chaya, he talks in Spandrel work also. It's the blatant homogenization and flattening of global architecture. Whereas we need to, a very strong need to keep architecture, culture sensitive, to keep it humanized and roots its context. In the same journal where Professor Akhtar Chauhan talks about, we need a humanized approach. We need to understand people, we need to interact with the community, we need to live with the society, we need to experience it, and that is how one can able to learn how they can, their designs could be culturally sensitive and it could be responsive, right? Thank you very much.